Welcome to CIS195 Week 7. This week we'll be focusing on the positioning of items on our HTML page. We're going to be focusing on two new methods. One is known as the flexbox and the other is the grid. Using these methods, we can take a HTML page here, which has no CSS applied to it, and ultimately come up with a page that will look something like this. Okay, let's go ahead and go back to our basic page here. So this is the index start.html page. I need to assign it the style sheet. So here's the style sheet styles start.css. Now if I refresh this, of course nothing should happen, because we actually have not added any styles yet. So let's go to the style sheet here. I've got some areas already predefined for us. Let's go to the general styling here. So what I want to do is I want to add some CSS to the header and the footer, because what I'm trying to do is center these on the page. And we can do that with the text-align option, and we'll just do that to center. So if I refresh this now, you'll notice my header, and if I scroll down, the footer should be both aligned here. Sorry about that little technical glitch there. I was trying to adjust this so you might be able to see the bottom a little better here. Okay, so now we've aligned those. So let's go ahead and let's add some more here. We've got some background and some borders around these different areas here on the page. So let's go over to the index start page here. And our pet food area, let's start there. That is here. This is within a main tag. It's actually within a class called product. So let's go ahead and use that as our styling point. So if I go back here to .product to indicate the class that I want to apply this to, and I want to have a border around this, so I'll just do a border style solid, and then I'm going to do a border radius, give it that rounded look, and we'll make this 15 pixels. So if I come back over here now and I apply our CSS, we should now have the border around these areas here. Let's see, also I want to give it a background color. This particular background should be light blue. So if I refresh that, there we go. Okay, so our colors are looking good. Our background looks good. Border looks good. So I need to do this for the other area here. This is the contact us, about us, etc. This is our navigation section, and this has a class nav assigned to each of those inner items. So if we go back to here, I'm just going to copy this. And instead of product, I'll make this the nav. And we'll change the color here to yellow. If I go back to our start page here, okay, there we go. So now I've got the basics set up for that. We've got the header aligned. We have set up a background color and a border and a radius around these, which are the basic setup that we need for our finished page. Okay, let's move back to our start page here. And we're going to start off by introducing a new concept called the Flexbox. So the Flexbox is a layout technique that allows us to arrange things within a container. Now, a container in this case, if I go back to our HTML, for our nav items, this section here can be our container. I've actually given that a class already called FlexContainer so that we can apply our CSS for the Flexbox to this container. Now, using Flexbox allows us to create simple arrangements. We can arrange things in a row or a column, and this can make things easy to create web pages that are very responsive for different environments like mobile devices. Okay, so let's go back to our Style Start CSS page, and we're going to go to the Flexbox styling area. And here I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in the class that we had set up over here, which is flex-container. So if I go flex-container in our brackets, and here I'm going to tell this it's going to become a Flexbox environment, so I need to use the option display and then use the attribute flex. Alright, so just doing this, if I refresh our page, you'll notice an instant change in the way that our page looks. This took all of our 3 navigational items and it placed them side by side, so in 3 different columns. So flex by itself, when applied to a container item, will place these in a column. Now I'm using the term container here kind of loosely. This does not have to have the name container. We're just using this because that's how Flexbox describes its environment. Now I'm going to add something here that we won't have in our finished product, but it's just to allow us to do some work so you can understand how this Flexbox is working. I'm actually going to put a border around the container itself. So I'll put a red border with solid style, about 2 pixels. So what this will do, this will outline it on the page for us so we can actually see. This is the Flexbox container. So this Flexbox container is this large red area here, and it currently has 3 items inside of it. So next, we can actually change the direction that these items within the container are moving. We can do that through an option called Flex Direction. So there are 2 main options. There's column and row. So let's go ahead and I'm going to change this to row so you can see what happens here. So, oops, row is the common standard. I was incorrect. Apologize. My mind thinks of these as being in columns rather than rows. So let's change that to column. And they're aligned up top to bottom. Okay, so that's a quick and easy way of changing the way this looks. There's also what's called column reverse and row reverse. And you'll notice when I do this, what's going to happen here is it's just going to reverse the order of these. So instead of about us, bulk orders, and contact us, it will reverse the opposite direction. Okay, so this isn't really what I want for us to be working with right now. So let's go back to row. So to place it in this look. Alright, so currently we have our items within our container all pushed up against the left side of the container. So let's go ahead and adjust that. So we can make some adjustments here by using what's called the justify content option. Now this has quite a few different options applied to it. So we're going to look at a few of these here. So let's look at the first one. Let's just do right. And what this will do is it'll move these items to the right side of this container. So let me refresh that. Left, of course, moves it to the left side of the container. And we're going to go ahead and stick with center for our purposes. Okay, so justify content, that allows us to move things left or right within a container. Now what about top to bottom? So in order to do this, we're going to need to change the size of the container. So I'm going to make it a little bit higher. So I'm going to give it a height here. We're going to go 200 pixels. And we'll refresh that so you can see this. So by default, these items in here are trying to span the height top to bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to make an adjustment to that. We're going to tell this to align these items in the center of our container. So refresh that. So in essence, what we've done here is we have told these items to align themselves both top to bottom, align items, and left to right, justify content in the center. Now there's another item I want to talk about here, and this is called wrapping. Wrapping will allow one line of a flex to actually move to a second line. Now it's only going to do this if we have the width of this much narrower than we are right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the width here of this. Let's go ahead and try 200 pixels of width. So you'll notice what happened here is these items are still trying to stay within the container, even though they don't fit anymore. They have shrunk themselves down as small as they possibly can, but they're not going to fit. So what we could do is we can add a flex dash wrap here, and the option we want is wrap. We refresh that. You'll notice now that they have wrapped themselves to fit within this width. They're still a little bit too tall, and we would have to do some work to fix that. That's not our point here. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to talk about ordering of items within a flex box. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to take out some of this that we've already created here. We don't really need this. So let's remove the width, flex wrap, align items, and height. So refresh that. So I'll put it back so that everything's in a line here. Now what I want to talk about now is that we can actually change the order of these items in which they appear within our flex box. And we can do this without actually going into the HTML and making changes. The way I can do this is through these IDs that I've created here for each one of these items. So the first item, the About Us, is called nav1. Then we have nav2 and nav3 for the other ones. If we go back into the CSS, we can actually add a new bit of CSS here. I'm going to tell it I want to apply this to nav3, and I'm going to use a command called order. Okay, so order will reorder items within the flex box. So in this case, they're ordered in the order that they are shown in the HTML. So About Us is first, Bulk Orders is next, Contacts Us is last. In the CSS Flexbox model, each one of these is given a number of which it's in the order. Strangely, that order is 0 for every one of them. It considers its order 0. So in order to make a change here, I have to adjust this number outside of that. So if I wanted, for instance, the Contact Us block to move in front of the About Us and Bulk Orders blocks, I have to give it an order that's lower than 0. In this case, we'll make it a -1. If you watch over here, this Contact Us will move to the left. So that changes the order of this. This can be useful depending upon the different devices that your web page is going to be used on. So instead of actually going into the HTML code, you can make some small adjustments in the CSS. Okay, that's all I want to talk about the Flexbox model. So we're going to move on to the grid model. Now this is another layout system similar to Flexbox, but it's much more complex. It allows much more complex layouts. Instead of a single dimension, either row or column, grid allows you to do things in 2 dimensions. Okay, so let's come back over into our CSS for our page. I'm going to go into the grid styling portion of our CSS page. So in this case, I'm going to apply our grid styling to our grid container. If I go back to our HTML page, our grid container is all of our products. So each of these blue areas is considered a product. So that's where we want to apply our grid to. So similar to the Flex container where I use display, I'm going to use the display option in this case. We're going to use the grid feature. Okay, so now if I refresh this over here, see what happens? Nothing. Nothing happens yet, because with the grid, the grid layout, we have to define the grid so that it can know how to lay out the content for us. So here I have to use the next command, which is the grid-template. Now in this case, I'm going to use this in the columns fashion. There's also a template for rows. Now in our particular look here, if we look at this, there's a total of 3 columns worth of information. So I need to tell our CSS to take this information here, these 6 items, and place them in a 3-column format. So the template here, how I'm going to do this is I'm going to use the word auto with spaces in between it 3 times. This is telling our content to automatically place yourself within 3 columns and set up the widths accordingly. So now if I refresh this, you'll notice that our grid, in this time the grid container, has told these 6 different items to place themselves in a 3-column grid. Now it stacked them 3 columns and then with 1 row and then 3 columns in another row. And this is just based on the number of items that are in here. If we would have had 8 items, we would have had 3 items, and then 2 items. Now if I don't like auto here, I can actually change these and turn this into specific values. I could do pixel sizes here, and this would adjust the sizes accordingly. That's not really what I want for our purposes, so I'm just going to put this back to auto for each of these. Alright, so let's go back here, and you'll notice that if I look at our final page, we actually have some separation between the different items. Well, there is none here. Well, I need to add what are known as gaps in here. It's very similar to doing margins or padding like we've done before. So within the grid formatting option, we're going to do a column gap, and we'll make that 10 pixels. So let me just show you what that does. So that puts in between the columns our gap, and we'll do a row gap for the other one. We'll make this just a little bit bigger. We'll make this 15 pixels. Actually, we'll do 20 pixels just to make it very apparent. What did I do? Oh, forgot my semicolon. The end of that one. There we go. Alright, so things are starting to look a little better. We've got our columns started out. We've got our gaps between the items. Now, we do have some other things here that aren't quite done yet. The pet food and the pet toys look a little differently here, but we'll get to that here momentarily. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about that piece next. So if we look at our finished page here, you'll notice that pet food, this item, spans 3 columns in one row, and pet toys spans 1 column and 2 rows. We can assign these spanning to these different areas within our grid container. Now we have to understand, how do we approach this? So one of those things is through what are known as grid lines. So grid lines are these invisible areas that the grid container understands about your layout. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a screenshot of this here. Oops. Rectangular snip. Why aren't you letting me do this? Rectangular snip. You're not letting me work. Interesting. And I'm not sure why that wasn't working, so I had to stop the video for a moment, but I finally got my snip. Okay, so here's a snipping. Here's a look at this particular layout and the associated items. So if I wanted to look at the grid lines, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to paint these on here. Oh, it's not going to let me. Sorry about that. My snipping tool just decided to not work for me properly. So I've moved over to paint here instead. So I want to show you where the grid lines are in the container. So if I go ahead and I choose a pencil, let's see, and I create a line here, and a line here, and a line here, and a line here. So each one of these is our grid line. So this first line, this would be line 1, grid line 2, grid line 3, and grid line 4. So in order for us to span across from 1 to 4, for the pet foods area, I have to put the appropriate coding within our style sheet. So let's come back to that. So let's go to our grid styling here. So this isn't for the container. This is actually for this particular item. In this case, we actually have an ID associated with it. It's called product 1. If I go back to the HTML, you'll notice here I've got for our pet food, it has an ID established against it called product 1, and that's what in our style sheet I'm going to refer to. Here I need to tell where I want to start the spanning from. So in this case, I want it to start on grid column, start 1. We'll do the same thing here, except for grid column, end, and we want it to end at 4. So let me bring back up our paint here. So we're starting at 1, spanning all the way across to 4. Alright, so let me go ahead and refresh this. You should notice now that has done exactly what we've asked it to. It started at the first line, went to the last line, and it moved everything else downward to fit within the different columns that have already been applied. Now if we go back to our finish sheet, you'll notice here that Pet Toys, it's spanning 2 different rows. So let's go back over to our sheet here, and let me put in the rows here. So we have a row there, 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 and there. So of course row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4. Okay. So in this case, we want this block for the Pet Toys to start at 2 and go to 4. So we'll go into here, we will add another item for product. In this case, this one's product 2. And this will be, instead of grid column, it will be grid row start at 2, and then grid dash row dash end 4. If we go back to our starting point here, hopefully this will do what it's supposed to do, and it did. So now it is spanning 2 rows and 1 column. Now everything is filled in correctly. Looks very similar to what we've got here. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about on grids. We're going to move on to the last topic, which is called a grid template. Now, grid template's a pretty powerful tool, and we're only going to touch the surface of it here. But it allows us to take content within a page and move it around at our will within the page, regardless of how that content is placed within the HTML page. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to start actually building the CSS for this, and I'll discuss how it works as we work through it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to apply our template to our entire HTML page. So I'm going to put this within the body. Now, it doesn't have to be within the body. It can be within smaller areas within the HTML, but what we're doing here is applying it to our entire page. So for our body, I'm going to do a display, and it is the grid display. But we're going to apply an option called grid template -areas. Now what this does, it allows us to define the entire grid itself. So in our particular case, if I come back over to our finished sheet, you can't see this, but there are actually 6 grid items here. It's a grid that's 2 columns wide, and there are 3 rows high. We define this area within our CSS by using a single quote here, and then we tell it what we want our area to be within our grid template. So we have 2 columns, in this case column 1 and 2. Now I'm going to use some names in here. These names will come back into use in a moment. They're not referring to anything in particular at this moment, but I'm just going to call them header and then header. Notice I have the name and then a space. It's very important. Now I do another line. Here I'm going to put main and section, and then at the bottom footer and footer. And then I close up this. Okay, so at this point, if I go back to our page and I refresh the page, you're going to notice some oddity happen. Now this is happening because I told the body to display as a grid. So it's actually gridding all of the different areas within my code. The grid template has not been applied yet because I have to do one more item before this. I have to take these grid areas here and I have to place these names within my HTML. Now this is something that's not currently there, so what I have to do is I need to add these. So for instance, I go back to here, our header. Within our header area here, I have to add a style equals, and I have to use the command grid-area, and I have to give it the same name as our CSS. So in this case, it's the word header. Now, like I said, this does not need to be the word header. It could be something else. But just for sake of understanding, it's a little easier to give it these same names. So let's put that header there. So I've got one portion of our template done. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to, oops, I misspelled that. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to place it in our other areas. So we also need this in our section. And this will be called section. We need it in our main. This will be called main. And we need it in our footer, called footer. Okay. Now if I refresh our page, you'll notice things are starting to look a little better. We've got one problem here, and this happens to be in the flex container, because we have told things that I want our flex to line things up right to left. So to fix this, I have to go back to my flex container, and instead of row here, I need to make this column. And then there we go. So we're pretty close to our final page. Now, I've done a little bit of work here within this content on our finished page, just to adjust the size of these a little bit. So if I were to go back to our nav block here, we can make some adjustments here for like the text, excuse me, the font size. Let's just make that extra small. Let's go back to our start page and refresh that. So that's pretty good. But we also notice there's a separation between these two. I can add that separation by going up one level, not necessarily our nav block, but I could go up one layer up to our section itself, in this case the flex container. So we could actually come back up here to our flex container and we could add a margin to the left and give it a 10 pixel margin. So that'll push things away from there. Alright, so that's better. We also have some separation between these in our flex container. So let's go ahead and make that adjustment. Okay, so go to our container. We can actually add a gap in here to this, which gives us, let's just make that 10 pixels. Go back to our start, refresh that, and then move to part. Okay, so things don't look exactly the way this other one looks, but it's close enough for the purposes of this lab. Alright, that's it for this week.